Hello, everyone. Welcome to our discussion on critical minerals and electrification, the long road to net zero. I am Sarah Rapucci. I'm the Global Head for Research Programs at Economist Impact. Electric vehicles are a really crucial part of the strategy to get us all to net zero. The transportation sector is responsible for about a quarter of the global carbon dioxide emissions from energy. But the minerals that are necessary components of batteries for electric vehicles and other automotive parts come with their own set of sustainability challenges. They're concentrated in only a few countries, many of which are facing internal conflict and human rights violations. They can be very resource intensive to extract, and they're vulnerable to trade policies and other geopolitical tensions. So if electric vehicles are going to fulfill their sustainability promise, we need to ensure that the supply chain for these critical minerals is ethical and is resilient. And these are the issues that we'll be talking about today. I have a great panel of experts with me to fill us in on their thoughts. Xavi Magu is the governing board vice president of the International Society of Sustainability Professionals. Jason Bordoff is the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University SIPA, and he's the co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School. Billy Pizer is chief executive of Resources for the Future, and Arthur Habenstock is chief strategy advisor, the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains at the U.S. Department of Energy. Thank you all so much for being here. We'll be dividing our discussion today into three broad themes. First, we'll talk about the impact of geopolitics on electrification. Then we'll turn to how to create sustainable and ethical supply chains in the critical minerals sector. And finally, we'll discuss future policies and the way forward. So I will jump right in, and I'll start with Xavi, with you. So you were recently with the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions, and you focused on the critical minerals agenda there. Based on your experience, how do you see international tensions and the evolving trade policies that we're all seeing right now affecting the supply chain for critical minerals for electric vehicles?
Thanks, Sarah. Great to be here. Our work with the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions really focused on in looking at the sector specifically, and the role of critical minerals really came up as a key theme this past year ahead of COP28. Our focus was really around the non-state actor community. So how can we work with different non-state actors, whether it's mining companies, NGOs, investors, civil society, and other kind of stakeholders, to ensure that there's sufficient support and acceleration towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement in line with 1.5. Now, when it comes to challenges around supply diversification, I think that has become increasingly apparent. We're seeing it even in the latest IEA Critical Minerals Outlook report. And what's becoming quite concerning is that supply concentrations are creating vulnerabilities, whether it's price volatility or whether it's making supply chains more vulnerable to disruption, extreme weather, trade disputes, or geopolitical tensions. And what we're really focusing on within the Climate Champions team is around ensuring that resource-rich nations are benefiting from kind of the opportunities that come from participating in this new momentum around critical minerals. We were involved in the Africa Climate Summit, where we heard from President Ruto around the opportunities, kind of shifting away from challenges, but really focusing on the opportunities that can be created when it comes to participating in the end-to-end value chain of critical minerals. I think it's becoming more and more apparent that extracting nations need to participate in the processing, but also battery manufacturing steps of that value chain. And it's a massive opportunity when it comes to job creation, when it comes to upskilling, when it comes to rather than exporting those raw materials, exporting higher value products later on in that value chain. Happy to discuss a bit more detail around kind of some of our efforts, but essentially what we were focusing on was where are we seeing positive initiatives when it comes to these efforts. And I'd like to just highlight the 2030 breakthroughs that were set under the leadership of the UN High-Level Climate Champions. These are, for the metals and mining sector, represent 60% reduction in operational emissions, a growing output in critical minerals up to 5-fold, and ensuring highest ESG standards. And these specific breakthroughs that were set under the leadership of the UN High-Level Climate Champions were developed based on comprehensive roadmaps to achieve the Paris Agreement in line with 1.5, and they essentially demonstrate positive tipping points for the sector, where we see that clean technology and sustainable solutions are becoming the preferred option at a national and a global scale. So this is really the focus of this initiative and this movement, to ensure that we can work with non-state actors to alleviate some of the challenges around supply diversification and grow the output of critical minerals, ensuring that just equitable energy transition is part of that journey.
Thanks so much, Tavi. Arthur, I'll turn to you. So the U.S. Department of Energy develops research to assess the readiness of supply chains for key energy technologies. What can you tell us about how geopolitical tensions are impacting the supply chains in the energy sector?
Sure. And traditionally, historically, that's most of what the Department of Energy did, which is to focus on the research. We are combining that research with a whole new emphasis on deployment. And Secretary Granholm likes to say that the three words that she says probably the most are deploy, deploy, deploy. And so we have a new section within the Department of Energy that's under the Undersecretary for Infrastructure, who's David Green. My office, the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains, is one of the offices that was born out of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act that is contributing this year alone in the neighborhood of $17 billion to uphold and to reshore and to start the flywheel of American manufacturing and critical materials processing to support the energy transition that includes the transportation sectors as well as the grid sectors. What we realized as part of that effort to ensure that we can successfully deploy and create a new foundation for that energy transition that was going to be sustainable and reliable, so that we first needed to understand where the dependencies were in the supply chain. We formed a consortium of the 17 national labs, as well as private sector interests, and our own internal Department of Energy experts, to really look at what those supply chains look like, what those dependencies were, where we had concentrations of foreign entity of concern, control, or ownership of critical materials for the automotive sector, but also throughout the energy transition. We are going to be making that information more available to the private sector, because as part of that deployment emphasis, what the department is seeking to do, and what the administration is seeking to do, is to have a government-enabled but private sector-led investment in this opportunity for the U.S. to share the $23 trillion clean energy transition that the world is looking at. And so what we're hoping to do is to provide that information so that it can help guide private investment, just as that information is currently guiding the billions of dollars that we're investing now.
Jason, I'll turn it over to you. I know you worked previously for the National Security Council under President Obama. Would you be able to tell us a bit about U.S.-China tensions and the impact that that's having right now on the push to electrification in the automotive sector?
Of course, and I'll just thank The Economist for the invitation to be here with this great group of panelists, and maybe give a special shout out to one of them, my friend Billy, and congratulate him on becoming the new CEO of Resources for the Future just a month or two ago, which is fantastic. It's an extraordinary organization. So just great to be here with all of you. As you said, my background in government in the Obama White House was at the National Security Council. And when I came here to Columbia to start the Center on Global Energy Policy, the idea was trying to bring expertise in geopolitics, national security, foreign policy, together with expertise in the energy transition and climate change, based on a thesis that we weren't going to be able to have a clean energy transition unless we address some of the most significant geopolitical challenges that you could see on the horizon. And for better or worse, in some cases worse, that proved to be a pretty good bet. And so I think looking at the broad landscape today, we are in a very complicated and in many ways troubling geopolitical time of rising conflict around the world, Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, a world that in particular in the last decade has moved from one of integration to one of more economic fragmentation. We see tensions rising between developed and developing countries. After decades in which the gap between rich and poor got smaller, it's getting wider again. You sort of go down the list with ways in which geopolitics can complicate, is today, I think, complicating this transition and making it harder. And some ways in which disorderly transition is making some of our geopolitical challenges worse. And so my colleague and frequent co-author Megan O'Sullivan, who runs the Belfer Center at Harvard, she and I have a new piece just out in Foreign Affairs talking about this kind of negative feedback loop we're in now, where geopolitics is making the transition harder. In some ways, we're going about the transition is making geopolitics more troublesome, and what it looks like to reverse that. Because we do believe that it is possible to really be thoughtful about your foreign policy in ways that accelerate the transition, and a faster transition really can be an antidote to some of the geopolitical problems we're seeing today. Your question highlights one of those, which is US-China competition, rivalry. In 2011, there was an op-ed in the New York Times, and one line from it was, "A successful China can make our country more prosperous, not less." That was an op-ed by then Vice President Joe Biden. And in 2019, 8 years later, two of the people most responsible for China policy today, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and Kurt Campbell, Deputy Secretary of State, wrote in Foreign Affairs that it was time for a rethink of the era of engagement with China. And that's where we are today. It's a fundamental shift in a half century, starting with Nixon engaging with China, to think about assumptions that were made in the 1990s when China was brought into the World Trade Organization. Permanent normal trade relations were established with China. The idea that a more integrated global economy, and China being more embraced in that, was going to accelerate democracy, accelerate the pace in which we came together in prosperity globally, which, basic principles of Ricardian free trade would suggest makes sense. I think what's happening today are a number of things, but part of it is, as Jake Sullivan said in an important speech he gave at Brookings, a view that perhaps China's not playing by the rules that we all thought were necessary when some of these assumptions were made in the 1990s. They have pursued a very heavy dose of industrial policy themselves over the last 20 or 30 years to build the dominant position that they have in many sources of clean energy. There's a political and economic competitiveness argument to this. I mean, at a basic level, you might say if we're going to take roughly $1 trillion of taxpayer money in the Inflation Reduction Act, it is simply not politically sustainable, or maybe economically sustainable, to say the largest beneficiary of that today is going to be China, the Chinese EVs, for example, and the decline in potential U.S. manufacturing of cars in a politically important state like Michigan. So all of these things are coming together, and there's a national security dimension as well, with the dominant position they have in some pieces of the advanced semiconductor industry or something. I think it is important to recognize the consequences of that, because for example, the Section 301 tariffs that were put in place against many aspects of clean energy technology a week or two ago, or a couple of weeks ago, those raise the cost of clean energy, and we need to be moving so much faster than we are today, not 2 or 3x, but like order of magnitude, 10x, 100x, to grow clean energy supply chains to get anywhere close to the climate goals that we need to achieve. We're so far away from them. And the idea that we can do that really without China being part of that mix is incredibly challenging. We just need to be honest about that, and then talk about the steps that are necessary to scale those supply chains both at home and in a very broad range of allies across the world, and also to build other tools of resilience and security, because diversification is only one place energy security comes from. Of course, geopolitics, there's nothing new about geopolitics and energy. It's been around for decades, traditionally oil and gas, but we're seeing now how it's going to play out in clean energy. And I think there are a number of lessons, we can come back to that, for other ways to build resilience into the system, in addition to trying to diversify supply chains and reduce China's role moving forward.
Jason, so much to talk about there, and I know we haven't had a chance to talk to Billy yet, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I'd argue pretty strenuously that what we're seeing is what we have seen historically, that when we overly rely on one source for our energy security, for our energy supplies, that we do so at our peril. The costs that we have been seeing in the energy sector have been artificially low, and for reasons that you alluded to. And in order for us to have a sustainable platform moving forward, we need that more secure foundation. We need to diversify our supply. I don't think that we need to necessarily focus on any one country, other than to say that we need to substantially reduce our reliance on those countries that don't share our values and aren't playing by the rules that you mentioned. And there's huge opportunity to do so. What has happened in Germany, what happened, what the concerns are in Taiwan. I had the good fortune to visit both countries as part of some of my prior work before becoming to go into the Department of Energy. There are shots across the bow. It's a recognition that the policy that relied so heavily on this notion that shared economic interest was going to be sufficient to support economic and energy security is not enough by itself. That we need more, that we need to have industrial policy. And I'd also argue pretty strenuously in the energy sector, we've always had industrial policy. We've always had industrial strategies. Energy sector capital investments are so large that we need to have government intervention to de-risk those investments. And that's exactly what this administration is trying to do.
Billy, I want to bring you in, and I'd love to zero in a bit more on this question of the critical minerals and the role that the particular role that they are playing right now in this debate. Could you tell us a little bit about how you're seeing things at this point?
Sure. I think it's already been alluded to, but we're trying to ramp up our our net zero ambitions, towards decarbonization in the transportation sector. And in electric vehicles and batteries in particular, there are concentrated supply chains that are creating security risks. And this is driving, a pretty sharp debate about the issue, culminating, as Jason mentioned, in the 301 tariffs a couple weeks ago. And as everybody has been saying, the general solution is diversification. That's how you protect against, how you deal with security and supply chains. Just two things to note. One is that it takes a long time to do this, so we shouldn't kid ourselves that if China has, or another country has, a dominant position in a particular area, such as graphite, that it's going to take a long time for other countries to build that sort of capacity. And in the meantime, there is inherently a trade-off between taking advantage of cheaper imports of Chinese vehicles and trying to build out that resilience. And I think we recognize that it's a more expensive approach, but it's probably worth it. And as Jason says, it's probably not politically sustainable to do it differently. The second thing I would just mention as well is that the effort to deal with security and critical minerals in particular is also lining up against the industrial policy that Art mentioned. These are not exactly the same things. We can solve our security problems to some extent by working with allies and diversification to try to source these minerals, in a more secure way. But we also, as people have said, we're looking at a future that looks very different than the past, a bunch of new industries, a lot of economic opportunity for the countries that are in leadership roles, and a recognition that the United States would like to be doing that, and that China maybe has already got a head start in a lot of these critical areas. So these things aren't totally aligned. I mean, obviously, if we did everything at home, we would be secure. We'd be more secure. but they're not exactly the same things. And so I think, we got to recognize that as we go forward.
Sarah, you encouraged us to sort of jump in and respond to each other, so I'll take you up on that, if that's okay. Because Billy, I agree with everything he said. The importance of diversification and lessons we can take from energy over decades. And, Winston Churchill a century ago famously said, security in oil lies in variety and variety alone. And so there is an important role for diversification. There are other tools for security as well. And so after the 1973 Arab oil embargo, we created the International Energy Agency. That was a group of countries coming together with strategic stockpiles. That's more complicated with minerals, but we can talk about that. We had actually not really good data about how oil markets worked, and we improved transparency and access to data that allowed for better functioning markets, so that when there is a disruption somewhere, markets can respond and pull supplies in from elsewhere, as we saw Europe do with gas supplies when Russia cut off pipeline gas to Europe. And the other thing I just want to say we shouldn't forget, I wrote a piece with someone who had just come out of making a lot of this policy, Brian Deese, who ran the National Economic Council a couple months ago. I was struck by a lot of the conversation about diversification in critical minerals is, where do we go do more mining, and how do we pull more stuff out of the ground? And that is complicated. It has social and environmental impacts. We certainly need to do more mining, and we should talk about that. But I was struck by this article that Amory Lovins wrote in Foreign Affairs right after the Arab oil embargo a half century ago, where he talked about the hard path and the soft path to energy security. And the hard path was breaking rocks all around the world and finding ways to extract more fossil fuels. And the soft path, the idea was, we don't, the way he described it, people don't really care about more oil. They care about hot showers and cold beer and what energy provides. The idea being that efficiency and some other things could do a lot of the work. And so I don't want to pretend we can recycle our way out of this problem entirely. But it is the case that with innovation and recycling and improved technologies, we can reduce the amount of critical minerals that we need to develop in the decades to come to meet our clean energy goals. And we shouldn't lose sight of the demand side of this either.
And Sarah, circling back to the other part of the question you asked me, if I could just jump in for a real quick second. I mean, recycling is a huge piece of it. And also the innovation that Jason mentioned. In addition to some of the work that we're doing to identify where the gaps are in the supply chains, not just for today's energy security and reliability, but for the success of our overall clean energy transition, we're doing a really hard think about how we take those materials that are out there and reuse them. And we've made a large amount of funds available for recycling of critical materials. But we're also using AI. We're using the tools of the national labs to identify what the mitigation measures might be, where we might find additional resources, but where we might find alternative resources that can help to do the same job. And so we're really excited about the support that the Department of Energy is doing, from the bench scale side of things at RPE all the way through our office, which is essentially an equity investor, and the loan programs office, which is on the debt side, to help this new innovation technology make the most of the critical materials we have and find alternative pathways when we can't.
And maybe if I could
I'm glad we're talking now more about resilience. And yes, Xavi, I definitely want you to jump in, but I just want to bring out the fact that we're delving in on these issues of technology and recycling and how we can build resilience. And Xavi, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. And just to actually just pick up on the points that were mentioned, I think that's so relevant, just thinking about diversification beyond building partnerships with countries that can help diversify the supply security of these critical minerals. The circular strategies are so critical. Design innovations are so critical. When I think about circular strategies, there's a massive opportunity if we maybe take learnings from what we've been able to do in the aluminium recycling sector. Specifically, we've managed to reduce emissions by 90% compared to primary aluminium. And aluminium plays a role in the expansion of electricity networks of the power grids alongside copper. And there's a recent report by the IEF that came out that actually, for us to meet the demand of the transition from ICE vehicles to EVs, and that kind of thinking about batteries, but also thinking about the expansion of the grid, we need about 6 new large copper mines every year for the coming decades. So there's a lot we can do when it comes to extraction of, recovery of minerals from whether it's consumer electronics, but also thinking about mine waste. There are innovations and technology developments happening in mining companies today. For example, Freeport-McMoRan is producing incremental copper from their large existing stockpiles of lower grade material that's currently classified as waste. So there are innovations that are happening when it comes to extraction from consumer electronics to mine waste, but also thinking about design innovations. Where we eliminate the need for some minerals that are classified as, for example, cobalt, a conflict mineral, are very, very risky when it comes to the social impact of the extraction of cobalt for EV batteries. The development of lithium iron phosphate batteries that are cobalt-free are already being used in EVs today. Actually, 44% of all EVs in China already use LFPs. They're cheaper, they don't degrade as quickly as cobalt, and even Tesla models are using such batteries today. So there's a lot of potential to kind of think around diversification more broadly.
Just quickly on that point about diversification, I would just note that two things get conflated sometimes, like China, competition with the US, and then trade, and they're not the same thing. So there's not a lot of things both parties in DC can agree on these days. One of them is we should maybe be viewing China more as a competitor than a partner. But I worry that in the years to come, one may also be a trend toward protectionism. And while there are a number of assumptions about kind of free trade that emerged in the 1990s that are important to rethink, if we're going to reduce China's dominant role in several aspects of the clean energy supply chain, that's going to require more, not fewer, partnerships and trade, maybe formal trade agreements, maybe other forms of international economic arrangements with other countries, because we can't do all of this domestically within our own borders at home. So if China is not going to play a role as a partner, as the Section 301 tariffs suggested, we need to, when we think about something like friendshoring, for example, in order to meet the clean energy goals we have, we need to take a very expansive definition of who our friends are. It's not Iran or North Korea or some other partners, but we need everyone else to be countries we work with to scale supply chains for clean energy and build closer economic integration with appropriate safeguards, not fewer.
Yeah, if I can just kind of jump in as well.
Yeah, Billy, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, this point about, the point about free trade is super important. I was reminded that if you go to the origins of resources for the future are actually, concerns about running out of natural resources in the 1950s. And the main messages that came out of the work that was done 70 years ago was really, a focus on innovation, which Chevy was mentioning, and B, a focus on trade. So, yes, you need to, target concentrated suppliers, and you need to worry about that, or processors. But the solution is really free trade, or is a freer trade system.
Billy, I wonder if you could just dig in a little bit deeper and maybe tell us a bit more, especially on this question of the ethical issues that are related to these critical minerals, and what some of the mechanisms are that you would advocate for to help mitigate that.
Sure. Well, certainly, when we think about developments in the U.S., at least, there are a lot of efforts underway when we have mining or processing facilities to think about how we measure and involve communities in the discussions of the different facilities. And I think that is a pretty active area. In the past, there's been a lot of exploitation of local communities and resources that, as we move forward into a clean energy economy, we want to make sure we're not repeating those mistakes. And a lot of it has to do with the engagement of the communities around the facilities or the mining operations to ensure that they're aware of what's going on, they're engaged in what's going on, that they understand what's going on, and it's not just an outside source of information that's saying it's okay. I think when you go beyond the United States, it gets a lot more complicated because the institutions are a lot weaker. The ability to monitor and verify what's going on in these sources are a lot weaker. But that needs to be an emphasis, because it's not really going to help us if we're solving climate change and we're worsening exploitation of people in another country, or worsening local environmental problems in another country. So we have to tackle that with better institutions.
Billy, that's exactly right. And thank you for saying it. I mean, one of the most important innovations of the work that we're doing in this administration is really focusing on the impacts of communities. We very consciously have recognized how many communities in the United States gave their all to create the infrastructure that we're all relying now on for our energy sector, and many of them have been left behind as manufacturing left the United States and went elsewhere. Jobs, expertise, all sorts of community economic value really disappeared. And so we are focusing on that in a laser-like way. And 40%, for example, of the $10 billion 48C tax credit that our office does much of the analysis for. Ultimately, Treasury and the IRS make the decision. But that's a really critical area for critical materials and manufacturing. And we just announced the new $6 billion second round of that. But with each one of these tax credit allocations or the grants that we make available, we look to ensure that there's a community benefits plan. That's not just a bolt-on. That's not just because it's a good to have. It's because we view ourselves as investors in these projects, and in order for them to get through permitting quickly, in order for them to be successful and to operate, we want to ensure that they are giving back to the community and the community supports them, and that the workforce is there to make sure that they can happen. Because when we talk to manufacturers and raw materials processors in this country, we recognize that a trained workforce is often the most critical material that they are missing, which is a real eye-opener, I think, for all of us. But it's also something that we're looking at on the international frame when we're looking at supply chains and where we are dependent on critical materials and components from elsewhere. We're looking to see what might disrupt that. And there are real significant issues, not just from the and not to undermine the importance of concerns about slave labor, that's extremely important, but also when we look at climate change and what that's likely to do to our supply chains and the ways in which those materials are delivered to our country. There are very serious concerns, and I as much as I think we've now woken up, I think that all that information was there. We're fortunate in some ways that we've had a shot across the bow, and because of COVID, because of some of the more recent geopolitical events, to recognize these are serious vulnerabilities we have to look hard at, plan for, and develop a plan to overcome.
I'd love to dig in more on the policy recommendations that can address some of these potential weaknesses in these supply chains. Jason, do you have thoughts on this?
Sure, there are so many. We talked a little bit about sort of some of the aspects of international diplomacy, international economic engagement, partnerships we need to build with a very broad range of suppliers, because it's just important to put in context the scale and magnitude of this transition and how big the numbers are. On our current trajectory, we need to double mineral supply, according to the IEA, by 2030. And of course, we're nowhere close to being on track for our climate goals. If we were, it would be 4 times as much. You see concerns about, Arthur can talk about them, about excess capacity, sort of talked about some of the investments China's making, how that can distort a global market. And that's true for where we are today. But we also want to skate to where the puck is going and think about what we need to build. So roughly half the electrolyzer capacity in the world is in China. Some of the largest electrolyzers in the world that can make green hydrogen, they each make somewhere around 10 to 20,000 tons, I think, of green hydrogen a year. To be on track for our climate goals, we need 70 million tons, according to the IEA net zero report, of low carbon hydrogen. So we want to be thinking about where we're headed and how to scale these. And that does mean, again, working with a very broad range of partners, which creates huge economic opportunities for Latin America, for Indonesia, for Africa, for parts of the world that hadn't been thought of before as potential suppliers of energy. We absolutely do need to make it easier to build things here in this country, and permitting reform is a big topic of discussion, whether that's transmission lines or mining. We need to do that in a way that does a better job than we have in the past, as Billy and Chavi said, about making sure that we're doing that in a responsible way and that local communities can benefit from that. The notions of free, prior, informed consent, local equity for local communities in the projects that are developed, so local and indigenous communities can benefit from it. If you look at the reserves in the United States of resources like lithium or nickel, 80, 90%, depending on which one you're talking about, are within 35 miles of a Native American reservation. And so if we don't get this right, there will be historically disadvantaged communities that are yet further disadvantaged. Innovation, we talked about before, as Arthur said, most of what DOE does is nuclear security and innovation, the National Lab System. And a lot we can do there to have improvements in electrochemistry. And some of my colleagues here in the Department of Engineering at Columbia are doing extraordinary work to reduce how much lithium we might need in batteries, or be able to store more energy with different electrolytes that you use in the battery chemistry, things like that, which are pretty significant. So a range of other recommendations too, but I think those are all really important ones.
Javi, please jump in.
In terms of creating ethical and sustainable supply chains and how this can be part of future policies moving forward, actually the UN Secretary General last year announced the launch of a critical energy transitions minerals panel. And that panel, in fact, is bringing together governments and non-state actors to develop a set of voluntary global principles, policies, and different partnerships to guide governments and other stakeholders across the value chain. And these sort of initiatives, if we think about even the work that is happening around ESG standards, organizations like the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, ICMM, Coppermark, and others, they are offering companies ways to demonstrate responsible mining practices through third-party audits, through site-level assessments, through multi-stakeholder engagement, where that kind of engagement with local communities is so essential, and it's so critical for this to be part of kind of the future way of business. I had the opportunity to attend a forum that IRMA was holding at their board of directors meeting earlier in the spring in New York. And that's where you truly see that such organizations are equally governed by all stakeholders, whether it's mining companies, whether it's purchasing companies like automotive players, NGOs, effective communities, labor organizations that were also mentioned earlier in this discussion, and investors. So bringing all these different stakeholders together to be involved in whether it's standards that are taken up by the private sector to being part of discussions that inform government level policy recommendations is so critical, because it really bridges the gap between the consumer and the supplier. And we're seeing efforts from organizations like ICMM and others bring together converged standards to make this easier for businesses to adopt. And I think just to kind of close off this idea is around the fact that this makes a lot of business sense for investors in particular, because having information and data on the performance at a site level that is third-party verified really provides transparency on ESG risk and gives more information on kind of how to make informed decision moving forward as we are more and more exposed to so many of these environmental and social risks that come forward, and enable that kind of social license to operate that's so critical in the mining sector.
Billy, I'm going to give you the last word. So please close us out.
That's a lot of pressure. Well, I was going to just quickly jump in and say two things. I mean, one is in this discussion of how to address community impacts and past justice inequities. We actually have had a series called Exposure, looking at environmental justice issues in the United States, and we have an event next Thursday, a week from today. 2 weeks from today, 3 weeks from today. It's actually, it's on June 12th, I should say that. That's looking at mining companies and local communities, and actually how you get effective, meaningful, and equitable arrangements. So particularly on this topic. The other thing I was going to mention is that something that Jason said earlier, I think is a really important policy angle, which is the transparency angle. I think it's very hard to find and deal with volatility, especially in these markets, without more information about the transactions that are taking place. It's actually in some sense easy. It's not innovation. It doesn't take a long time. It's not diversifying supply chains. It take a long time. It's really about just getting better information into the market for people to make better and quicker decisions.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you all for a really fascinating discussion. I love this idea of the fact that quicker energy transition can help ease some of the geopolitical tensions that we're discussing, even as those tensions are holding things up in our push for net zero in many ways. And I hope that many of these policy prescriptions around diversification, around diplomacy and partnerships, new technologies, recycling can help us move faster in that direction. So thank you all again. And thank you to our audience. And I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Take care.